Hello and welcome to Beyond the Headlines, the show that delves past the surface story to give you analysis of the major issues and topics being discussed statewide, nationally, and globally, with interviews with local newsmakers from professors to politicians and everyone in between. I'm your host, Justin Chenette. Today's guest is here to talk politics. He is a political science professor at Lyndon State College and author of the book Democracies and Foreign Policy, The Influence of Leaders and Institutions on the Foreign Policies of Democracies. Dr. David Plazek, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's start off with your book, Democracies and Foreign Policy. It sounds pretty straightforward and self-explanatory, but can you go a little bit into how that book got started? Why did you write it? And a little bit of content for the people that may have not read it yet.
Well, why I wrote it is pretty cut and dried. It was my dissertation, and I was lucky enough to get it published. And I essentially focus on the notion that we hear presidents speak of democracy as being an element for contributing peace to international relations, and I've thought that there might be differences between different types of democracies, as in that democracies aren't homogeneous, they tend to be heterogeneous. So I drew on the work of Aaron Leiphardt and some other smart people who stood on their shoulders, as we say, and mixed their theories and found that yet certain types of democracies, what we call consensus democracies, indeed do have more peaceful foreign policies than majoritarian democracies. So that was the essential gist.
And you also analyze presidencies?
I analyze presidencies because I believe leadership can be a significant variable, and not all theoretical perspectives agree with that.
Well, speaking of presidencies, President Barack Obama has been hitting the campaign trail hard in anticipation for the midterm elections, which is taking place on November 2nd. Gallup poll is suggesting that there's an 18% approval rating for the democratically controlled Congress right now, while Barack Obama's approval rating is below 50%, and satisfaction overall with the American people with how things are going in the United States is well below 40%. Would that data suggest that Republicans might make major gains in both the House and the Senate during this election cycle?
Might, it does. They should. And you add into that whoever's in the White House, that person's party loses. Generally, it's almost law-like, but not completely, will lose seats. And so the Democrats right there are supposed to lose seats. We have popularity down, but most importantly, like Bill Clinton said in '92, it's the economy, stupid. How the economy goes, so goes the fortunes of the ruling party. We could debate about who's responsible. Obviously, the real crash was a couple years ago, before Obama was in power. But that's beside the point. People will lose sight of that. They can be politically short-sighted. And when people are trying to put food on their table, and unemployment's as high as it is now, all the ducks are in order for the Republicans to do very well on November 2nd.
What's your prediction? Do you think that the Republicans will take both houses of Congress, or just one or the other, and just make major gains? What's your prediction?
I am not in the prediction business. I'm not very good. So, but if you're asking me, I would say that they won't take either house. They had a better chance at the Senate before some of the less establishment Republican candidates won their primaries. Had that not happened, like the O'Donnells and whatnot, hadn't they not won their primaries, I would have said the Senate would have gone Republican. But remember, each race is individual, and everybody likes to blame Congress, but not their individual politician, the person that represents them. So and I'm not good at this, you want to ask me what I think is most significant, that I'm better at, but predicting, don't sell the farm and put it on my predictions, but I would say both houses will remain with the Democrats, but the Republicans will make gains in both houses as well.
You mentioned this, so I want to bring it up. Let's talk tea, in particular the Tea Party's influence in the midterm elections. They made major gains over mainstream Republicans during the primaries, such as, like you mentioned, Christine O'Donnell, the Tea Party-backed candidate in Delaware, who beat Republican establishment candidate Mike Castle, who was a party veteran. He was a former governor. She won 53% of the vote in that race. In addition, the New York Republican primary for governor, the Tea Party-backed Carl Palladino received 62% of the vote in that election. Those are just two examples. Do you think moving forward, and you kind of hit upon this in the last question, do you think the Tea Party might be a little too polarizing in a general election scenario, particularly in this coming election?
Well, to start, my first concern is how O'Donnell is... she said she fooled around with witchcraft before, and my thought is, boy, that's going to have a chilling effect on witches that might run for office. But aside from that, I don't think these candidates are. O'Donnell's behind, double-digit points, very far behind. I don't think many of these type of candidates are going to do well in primaries. With their base, but I am not too certain. I don't think they're going to do very well once they get into the campaign against Democrats, in particular because you can win in two ways. You can win either by appealing to your base and getting a big turnout, or you win the middle. You win the independents and the moderates. Well, more extreme candidates aren't going to win the middle. And Tea Party candidates are a more extreme right movement. And here's the other problem, and to me this is the real, if what I was saying before, I'm not good at predictions, but if I think there is one significant thing developing, it's the civil war within the Republican Party between the mainstream Republicans, as you called them, or more traditional, and the Tea Party candidates. To the point where it's like the rhinos, the Republican in name only, moderates against the more extreme Tea Party types. And I think that's the real issue. How is that going to play out? If I were to make a prediction here, I don't think the Tea Party candidates are going to do very well. I think I don't know that they're going to have much success at all. And that's going to be all the more mainstream Republicans will need to reestablish their control over at least the institutions of the Republican Party, if not the minds of the electorate.
What does this signal, the entire Tea Party movement, what does this signal to the GOP leadership in terms of this kind of civil war that you mentioned taking place in the party? What do they need to be doing in terms of maybe reaching out to these folks to say, you know, hey, look, we understand your concerns, you know, this is what we're going to do to incorporate them. What do they need to be doing?
Well, they can go two ways. They can embrace them and join them. And we've seen some of that. We've seen more moderate candidates move in their direction. McCain comes to mind if you hear some of his comments, although his selection of Sarah Palin kind of is, I'm not sure he's the best example. But I think if I were a Republican strategist and I wanted my party to win, I would look back to William Buckley when he said we need to get rid of the people from the farther right. Back then it was the John Birch Society in particular, the people that were worried about fluoride in the water and whatnot, and said, listen, we're going to be in the wilderness for a really long time unless we get rid of the what was it, kookier elements of our side of the equation, and so I think a winning strategy in the long run is kind of because let's face it, whether you're talking birthers or you're talking Obama's a Muslim or Obamacare is a government takeover, a lot of it is simply not fact-based. And some of it, whether it's fluoride in the water or UN conspiracies to take over the United States, are just fantasies, fantasy conspiracy. Ultimately, people will see through facades. I'm certain of that. I'm an optimist about the American people, but I think the American people, conventional wisdom, ultimately will see through canards to see ultimately, maybe in the short term you can fool people, right, but not in the long term if your product is not completely reality-based. And that's why I think you push those guys to the side. And they're good. A lot of these people are politically active, and they're going to vote anyways. And it's not like they're going to switch parties, right, and vote for the Democrats. You still have those guys. Right. So you take over and put a more a saner face, a more marketable face, quite frankly, for electioneering purposes, on the front of the party or as the face of the party. And I think in the long term, that's what they're really going to need. And I think my prediction, like I said, I think the Tea Partiers aren't going to do well, and more mainstream Republicans are going to just put their foot down and do that sort of thing. I really believe that's going to happen.
You mentioned basically political manipulation of some facts in order to kind of either rally a base or get behind a certain candidate or politician. What kind of advice would you give people to kind of protect themselves or educate themselves in order so that they don't get fooled by politicians that might try to stir up the masses using emotionally charged rhetoric or manipulation tools? What kind of advice would you tell them?
Well, this brings up the classic fear of democracy. Throughout the centuries until recent time, democracy was a dirty word because people feared it was mob rules, or as you know, as I call it in class, the Jerry Springer effect. Right. Those people vote too. And how do you get people to think with their head more than their gut? Sorry, Stephen Colbert. The first thing I would suggest is when you hear somebody from one party talking about the other party, don't put too much weight on what they're saying. Because more often than not, they're going to have straw man appraisals, and a straw man is a false representation of your opponent that's easily defeated. And so when you hear either politicians that are left or right, or talking heads or spinners that are left or right, and they start telling you what the other side is about, really take it with a big grain of salt. That's the most important clue. And the other thing is when you get time, at least consume some media, try and educate yourself. I know people work hard. That these are hard times, and people put in long hours if they're lucky enough to have a job. But do the best you can to educate yourself. But if I were to give one little clue, if a Democrat's talking about a Republican, or a Republican's talking about a Democrat, don't put too much weight into what they're saying.
Like mudslinging, for instance.
Mudslinging, direct falsehoods, or that's what I consider mud. If somebody's misrepresenting or outright lying about somebody, that's you may not always be able to tell that apart from the factual part, and even more so, they're going to at least put as we say, a spin or a twist on their presentation to highlight their side and diminish the other side. It's a competitive game trying to win elections, and both sides are trying to win, and people need to know that as they try to figure out what's true and what's not.
Right. With talk of the midterm elections, there's always talk that gets brought up of the next election, which is in 2012. Now, even with the world supposedly ending, we have to contend with the presidential election first. President Obama promised major reform and change throughout the election, and yet some people seem to not be feeling that particular change. 1 out of 10 Americans are out of work, and even details of the healthcare reform law that was passed. There's questions in terms of the impact of small businesses and on the average Joe six-pack. Some people are nervous about, what does it mean for me yet? It's still, the details haven't really been mainstream in the media because the full implementation won't be until 2014, though parts of it will be kind of phased in. What does candidate Obama have to do in a possible re-election as an incumbent president in order to not become the next Jimmy Carter?
Well, some of it he's starting to do already. He's starting to tout his accomplishments, because even though this isn't part of the media script, quite a lot has been achieved. This has been one of the more productive Congresses in the last few decades, several decades. And like healthcare, but he's been doing this. He mentioned the waiver for senior citizens that's available now. He mentioned he's been talking publicly about how children can stay on, or young adults can stay on their parents' policies until they're 26. And young people can't be turned down, children can't be turned down for having pre-existing conditions by health insurance companies. These are wins for just about everybody except the private insurance corporations.